I've been crushing little public defenders like you for 25 years.
Ring. So they sent you to negotiate our $50 million settlement?
The mahogany-paneled courthouse conference room reeked of expensive cologne and old money privilege. At the head of the gleaming table sat Richard Blackwood, senior partner at Manhattan's most prestigious law firm, his $3,000 suit as sharp as his condescending smile. Across from him, in a simple black blazer from Target, sat the woman they'd assigned to represent the other side. So they sent you to negotiate our $50 million settlement? Blackwood's voice dripped with disdain as his cold blue eyes swept over her worn briefcase, her modest jewelry, her natural hair pulled back in a simple bun. I suppose the public defender's office ran out of real lawyers. The woman, 32 years old, carrying herself with quiet dignity despite the obvious slight, simply opened her weathered legal pad. She'd heard worse, much worse, in courtrooms across the city, in law school lecture halls, in job interviews where they looked right through her despite her credentials. But something flickered in her dark eyes when Blackwood leaned back in his leather chair and chuckled. "Look, sweetheart," he continued, his Harvard law ring catching the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, "I've been practicing corporate litigation since before you were born. My firm has never lost a case of this magnitude. Why don't you run back to your supervisors and tell them to send someone who actually belongs in this room?" The other corporate lawyers, 5 white men in identical expensive suits, snickered behind their Mont Blanc pens. They saw what Blackwood saw, a public defender who probably went to some state school, who represented petty criminals and domestic violence cases, who had no business sitting across from the legal titans of Wall Street. What they didn't see was the way her fingers tightened slightly around her pen when Blackwood mentioned corporate litigation. They didn't notice how her breathing changed when he dismissed her education, and they certainly didn't catch the split-second flash of something dangerous in her eyes before she looked down at her notes. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, her voice steady and professional, "perhaps we should review the case details before making any assumptions." He waved his hand dismissively. "Assumptions? The only assumption here is that the city thought a public defender could handle a $50 million negligence case against my client. That's not assumption, that's comedy." As the laughter echoed around the room, she made a single note in the margin of her pad. Just 3 letters. USC. Because sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones nobody sees coming. If this story moves you, hit that subscribe button. We share incredible stories of overlooked heroes every week. Rate this story from 0 to 10 in the comments, and tell us about a time you witnessed hidden talent being dismissed. Your stories matter, and they inspire our next videos. This one's going to shock you. Trust me, you won't see this ending coming. Keisha Williams had worked in the Manhattan Public Defender's Office for 8 years, handling everything from petty theft to murder cases in windowless rooms that smelled of industrial cleaner and broken dreams. The prosecutors walked by her in courthouse hallways as if she were part of the furniture. Just another overworked, underpaid public defender drowning in case files and unrealistic deadlines. But Keisha watched. She always watched. The prestigious law firms swept into court with their armies of associates, their leather briefcases worth more than she made in a month, their confidence radiating from every expensive thread. They spoke in the coded language of elite education, casual references to professors at Harvard, Yale, Columbia. The kind of shorthand that immediately identified who belonged in their world and who didn't. Keisha had learned to make herself small in those moments, to fade into the background, to let them dismiss her while she quietly dismantled their arguments piece by piece. On that Tuesday morning in March, she'd been assigned the Riverside Construction negligence case, a $50 million lawsuit against one of the city's largest development companies. The case had been bounced around the office for weeks. Nobody wanted it. The defendant had hired Blackwood, Sterling, and Associates, and everyone knew what that meant. Brutal depositions, endless motions, and a legal war of attrition designed to exhaust the city's limited resources. "They're going to destroy us," her supervisor, Tom Martinez, had said, while dropping the thick case file on her desk. "Blackwood's already filed 17 motions to dismiss. He's stalling until we run out of money or patience." Keisha had flipped through the preliminary documents, her trained eye catching details others had missed. The construction timeline, the permit applications, the safety inspection reports that didn't quite align with the official narrative. "What's the core issue?" she'd asked. "Building collapse. 3 workers died, 12 injured. Riverside claims it was unforeseeable structural failure. Cities alleging negligent construction. Practices and code violations." That's when she'd heard it, drifting from the conference room across the hall, where the senior attorneys were discussing their strategy. "The problem is proving willful negligence versus standard construction risks," one voice said. "We need to establish a pattern of code violations and show the company knew about structural deficiencies." Another voice responded, "But how do we counter their engineering experts? They've hired the best structural engineers in the country. Our budget can't compete with their technical testimony." Keisha had moved closer to the doorway, her pulse quickening. Those words weren't foreign to her. They were speaking her language, a language she hadn't used professionally in almost 9 years. She'd whispered to herself, "You need to examine the concrete pour records and cross-reference them with the weather data. If they poured during freezing temperatures without proper additives..." Tom had looked up from his desk with a confused smile. "What was that, Keisha?" "Nothing," she'd said quickly. "Just thinking out loud." But deep inside, something had stirred. Something she'd buried under years of criminal defense work, under the daily grind of plea bargains and overloaded dockets, under the weight of financial necessity that had redirected her career path almost a decade ago. That wasn't just legal intuition. That was structural engineering expertise finally waking up. 3 days later, the Blackwood team still lingered in the courthouse conference room, their voices growing sharper as they reviewed the city's response to their latest motion. "They're actually fighting this," James Sterling, the junior partner, said with obvious irritation. "I thought they'd settle for $10 million by now." "They've assigned some public defender named..." Blackwood flipped through his papers. "Keisha Williams. Probably fresh out of some third-tier law school." The secretary who brought coffee had mentioned seeing her in the law library every night that week, staying until security kicked her out. Research that seemed oddly focused for a simple negligence case. When the preliminary hearing arrived, Keisha sat at the plaintiff's table with her worn briefcase and single legal pad. The defense team filled 2 entire rows. 7 attorneys, 4 paralegals, 3 jury consultants, and enough documentation to build a small fort. Judge Harrison called for opening statements. Blackwood rose first, commanding the courtroom with the kind of presence that came from 3 decades of victories and a voice trained to fill opera houses. "Your Honor, this tragic accident was exactly that. An accident. Riverside Construction followed every safety protocol, exceeded industry standards, and complied with all municipal codes. The building collapse was caused by an unprecedented combination of weather conditions and soil subsidence that no reasonable party could have foreseen." His presentation was flawless. Charts, timelines, expert testimony lined up like dominoes. The kind of opening that made judges lean forward and opposing counsel reach for settlement papers. Then Keisha stood up. She approached the podium without fanfare, placing her single notepad beside the microphone. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "Your Honor, the defense would have you believe this collapse was unforeseeable. But structural failures don't happen in isolation. They happen when concrete is poured at 32 degrees without freeze protection additives. They happen when construction schedules prioritize speed over safety. and they happen when companies choose profits over lives. Without thinking, she continued, if the court examines the concrete pour records from December 15th through 18th, cross-referenced with National Weather Service data, you'll find that Foundation Team Alpha poured load-bearing columns during a freeze warning. The concrete compressive strength tests from those pours show a 38% reduction from specified values. Dead silence. 15 pairs of eyes turned to her. The kind of silence that happens when someone speaks a language fluently that they're not supposed to know. Blackwood's confident expression cracked for just a moment. Your Honor, I object to this unsubstantiated technical speculation from counsel who clearly lacks the engineering background to make such claims. Judge Harrison looked puzzled. Ms. Williams, do you have documentation to support these technical assertions? Keisha felt the familiar heat of dismissal, but this time, something was different. This time, she didn't shrink back. I do, Your Honor. The city requests a 30-day continuance to present a comprehensive structural analysis of the construction records. Objection! Blackwood was on his feet. The plaintiff cannot introduce new technical theories this late in preliminary proceedings. This is obviously a desperate stalling tactic by an inexperienced attorney who's in over her head. The judge granted the continuance, but as they filed out of the courtroom, Blackwood cornered Keisha in the hallway. Listen carefully, he said, his voice low and threatening. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but I've been crushing little public defenders like you for 25 years. You just embarrassed yourself in there with that technical nonsense. Next time, stick to what you know. Plea bargains and parking tickets. Keisha walked away, but this time the familiar shame felt different. This time it felt like anger finally waking up. That wasn't embarrassment burning in her chest. That was expertise demanding to be heard. In her small Brooklyn apartment that night, Keisha sat with a leather-bound portfolio she hadn't opened in 8 years. On the cover, embossed in fading gold letters, USC Viterbi School of Engineering, Master of Science in Civil Engineering. The pages were filled with structural calculations, concrete chemistry formulas, and load distribution diagrams that had once been as natural to her as breathing. Her thesis on thermal effects on concrete curing in urban construction had been published in 3 engineering journals. She'd graduated summa cum laude, with job offers from every major engineering firm on the West Coast. Back then, this was her language. She could read building plans like poetry, could spot structural deficiencies from 100 yards away, could calculate load-bearing requirements in her head while walking through construction sites. The last time she'd opened this portfolio, she'd been 26 years old, sitting in a hospital room beside her dying mother's bed. Lung cancer, stage 4, diagnosed too late because she'd worked 3 jobs instead of going to doctors she couldn't afford. Baby, her mother had whispered through the oxygen mask, you remember what I taught you about helping people? Keisha had held her hand, watching the woman who'd raised her alone, who'd worked double shifts at the hospital cafeteria to pay for engineering school, who'd never once complained about the sacrifices. You remember Mrs. Johnson down the hall? How she couldn't afford a lawyer when that landlord was trying to evict her illegally? Mama, rest. Don't talk. And Cousin Marcus? When they charged him with that burglary, he didn't commit. Remember how we couldn't find a lawyer who cared enough to fight for him? Keisha had known where this conversation was leading. She'd seen it in her mother's eyes for weeks. You got a gift for understanding systems, baby, for seeing what other people miss. But there's 2 ways to use a gift like that. You can make money, or you can make justice. 3 months later, her mother was gone. The medical bills had consumed Keisha's savings, her college fund, everything. The engineering job offers suddenly felt hollow against the memory of her mother's words and the overwhelming debt that made law school seem impossible. But Keisha had found a way. Night school at Brooklyn Law while working construction during the day. Ironic, really, Inspecting the same kinds of buildings she'd once designed, she'd discovered she had a different kind of gift. She could see through lies, could detect the structural weaknesses in legal arguments the same way she'd once spotted flaws in concrete pours. The public defender's office had recruited her after she'd graduated third in her class despite working full-time. They needed someone who understood the system from the bottom up, someone who could fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She'd told herself she was honoring her mother's memory, fighting for justice, making a difference, but somewhere along the way, she'd started to forget. The endless caseload, the dismissive prosecutors, the judges who barely looked up when she spoke. She'd let them convince her that she was just another overworked public defender, that her engineering background was just an interesting footnote in her file. Until today, until Blackwood's condescending smile reminded her exactly what she'd walked away from, and why Keisha didn't cry as she turned the portfolio pages, studying the structural analysis methods she'd once known by heart. She didn't mourn the engineering career she'd abandoned or the corporate salary she'd never earned. Instead, she turned to her laptop and started typing. Case law searches, engineering database queries, technical journals she still had access to through her USC alumni account. "There it is," she whispered, finding the precedent she needed buried in a 2018 appellate decision. It was always there, because she hadn't abandoned engineering for law. She'd simply found a way to use both, weapons in the same fight. And Richard Blackwood had just made the mistake of bringing a privilege to an expertise fight. The city courthouse was still, draped in pre-dawn silence when Keisha stepped through the security checkpoint at 43 R.B.5 a.m. She entered the law library through the back entrance using her after-hours access card, her laptop bag heavy with 8 years of suppressed expertise finally unleashed. The hall was silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. No hesitation this time. She spread the construction documents across 3 library tables like a general planning a siege. Concrete pour records, weather data, soil analysis reports, building permits, inspection schedules. Then she opened her engineering software, programs she'd kept current through USC alumni access, tools she'd told herself she was maintaining just in case. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with muscle memory she'd thought was lost. Load calculations, concrete compressive strength analysis, thermal expansion coefficients, cross-referencing every concrete pour with national weather, service hourly temperature readings. There, December 16th, 2022, 2:30 a.m. to 6:15 a.m. Riverside. Construction had poured the critical load-bearing, columns for floors 12 through 18 during a freeze warning. Temperature, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. No cold weather protection additives documented. No heating protocols followed. But that was just the beginning. She pulled up the soil subsidence data Blackwood had cited as the unforeseeable cause. Then she cross-referenced it with the foundation depth specifications. Her breath caught. "You lying bastards," she whispered. The foundation depth was 60% of what the soil conditions required. They'd known about the unstable substrata. It was documented in their initial geological survey, but going deeper would have cost an additional $2.3 million and delayed the project by 4 months. So they'd gambled. With physics. With lives. When she finished her analysis at 7 a.m., Keisha looked at the devastating technical report she'd compiled. 43 pages of engineering evidence that would destroy Riverside construction and humiliate Blackwood's unforeseeable accident defense. There was nothing else to say. She quietly gathered her materials and left. At 9 a.m., Judge Harrison opened his email to find a comprehensive structural analysis that read like a murder confession written in engineering equations. By 9:15, his clerk was frantically calling both legal teams for an emergency hearing. By 9:30, word was spreading through the courthouse. The public defender just filed a technical brief that makes Riverside look like they deliberately killed those workers. Blackwood's assistant burst into his office at 9:45. "Sir, you need to see this. The Williams woman. She's filed some kind of engineering report. Our structural experts are calling it devastating. They're saying she identified construction defects our team missed." Within minutes, 3 of Blackwood's senior associates were speed-reading through pages of technical analysis none of them fully understood, but all of them recognized as catastrophic. "This could be malpractice," whispered James Sterling. "If she's right about the concrete pours and foundation depth, we missed evidence that proves willful negligence." The courthouse Twitter account, run by a court reporter with 50,000 followers, posted at 10:15 a.m. "Breaking: Public defender in 50 meters construction case drops technical bombshell. Defense team in emergency meeting. This is getting spicy." Soon, legal bloggers and court watchers were retweeting, sharing, speculating. Someone posted a photo of Keisha walking into the courthouse carrying engineering textbooks alongside her legal briefs, with the caption, "Plot twist. She's not just a lawyer." The Riverside case hashtag started trending in legal Twitter circles. "This could be the upset of the decade," posted court. Watch NYC, they pulled the security footage from the law library, and there she was at 5:30 a.m., working alone with engineering software and technical manuals. They checked her bar admission records, then cross-referenced with university databases. "Keisha Williams," the court clerk read aloud. "USC Viterbi School of Engineering. Master of Science, Civil Engineering, 2016. Published thesis on concrete thermal effects. Graduated summa cum laude." "That's the public defender," whispered Blackwood's paralegal, her voice barely audible in the suddenly quiet war room. At 2 p.m., Keisha sat across from Blackwood and his entire legal team in Judge Harrison's chambers. Her USC engineering portfolio rested on the mahogany table beside her worn legal pad. 2 worlds finally brought together. "You want to know who I am," she said calmly, looking directly at Blackwood's pale, shocked face. "So I'll tell you. Before I went to law school, I designed the structural systems for 37 buildings across Los Angeles. I published research on concrete chemistry that's still cited in engineering journals today. I could have worked for any major firm in the country." She opened her portfolio, revealing pages of calculations and structural diagrams. "But I watched my mother die because she couldn't afford health care. I watched my cousin get railroaded by the system because he couldn't afford competent legal representation. I watched good people get crushed by corporations and institutions that saw them as expendable." Her voice remained steady, professional, but something dangerous flickered in her eyes. "So I made a choice. I could use my engineering knowledge to make rich developers richer, or I could use it to fight for people who don't have a voice. I chose justice over money." She pulled out the construction timeline Riverside had submitted as evidence. On December 16th, your client poured concrete in sub-freezing temperatures without cold weather additives. That concrete never reached full compressive strength. It was 38% weaker than specifications required. Blackwood opened his mouth to object, but she continued. They also shortened the foundation depth by 40% to save money and time. Despite geological reports showing unstable soil conditions, that wasn't unforeseeable subsidence, Mr. Blackwood. That was calculated negligence. She placed a soil analysis report in front of him. Your experts missed this because they assumed no one would have the engineering background to catch it. They were counting on the city's public defenders being too overworked and undertrained to understand the technical aspects. Judge Harrison leaned forward, studying the documents. Ms. Williams, are you saying the defendant knowingly constructed an unsafe building? I'm saying they made conscious decisions to prioritize profit over safety. Your Honor, The engineering evidence proves willful negligence resulting in 3 deaths that were entirely preventable. Blackwood's face had gone ashen. 25 years of courtroom dominance, and he'd been blindsided by a public defender with a secret engineering degree. You deliberately concealed your engineering background, he stammered. Keisha's smile was sharp as a blade. I didn't conceal anything, Mr. Blackwood. You just assumed that a black woman working as a public defender couldn't possibly have expertise that threatened your case. Your racism became your tactical weakness. She gathered her materials with methodical precision. I didn't leave engineering, Mr. Blackwood. Engineering never left me. I just had to walk away for love. Love for my mother. Love for justice. Love for people who get dismissed and underestimated every single day. In that quiet chamber, they finally saw Keisha Williams not as just another overworked public defender, but as what she'd always been, a brilliant engineer who'd chosen to weaponize her expertise against exactly the kind of corporate arrogance Blackwood represented. The settlement offer is $50 million, she said quietly. Full amount, non-negotiable. You have until tomorrow morning to decide whether you want this to go to trial. As she walked toward the door, Blackwood called out desperately, Wait! We need time to review. Mr. Blackwood. She turned back with that same quiet dignity she'd maintained through years of dismissal and condescension. Perhaps you should have thought of that before you assumed I didn't belong in the room. The next morning, Keisha stepped into the courthouse lobby like always, but something was fundamentally different. The security guards nodded respectfully. Court reporters looked up from their phones. Even the prosecutors who'd dismissed her for years were watching with new interest. Then a spontaneous wave of applause started from the public gallery. Families of the construction workers who'd died, other public defenders, law students who'd been following the case on social media. Thank you, said Maria Santos, whose husband died in the building collapse. Thank you for seeing Miguel as more than just another construction worker, for fighting like his life mattered. The applause continued as Keisha walked toward the courtroom where Blackwood waited with settlement papers already signed. $50 million, full admission of negligent construction practices, and something unprecedented. A formal apology from Riverside Construction acknowledging their failures. But more importantly, the case had triggered a broader investigation. The district attorney announced that 3 Riverside executives would face criminal charges for willful endangerment. The City Planning Commission opened reviews of 47 other Riverside projects. The Construction Industry Trade Association issued new safety protocols specifically addressing the defects Keisha had identified. Later that week, Judge Harrison made an unusual announcement from the bench. The court recognizes that this case represents exceptional advocacy that saved the city from a miscarriage of justice. Ms. Williams's technical expertise prevented the dismissal of valid claims that might otherwise have been overlooked. A new fellowship would be created, the Keisha Williams Fellowship for Interdisciplinary Legal Advocacy, providing full scholarships to law students with technical backgrounds who commit to public service. She was invited to speak at legal conferences, to teach a seminar on technical litigation at Brooklyn Law, to consult on construction cases across the state. Under one condition, I stay in the public defender's office, she told every offer. That's where I'm needed most. The Columbia Law Review wanted to publish her article on engineering, expertise in legal advocacy. The Bowie National Association of Public Defenders invited her to keynote their annual conference. Engineering firms reached out, offering consulting contracts that would triple her salary. But the most meaningful invitation came from USC, Viterbi School of Engineering. Would she consider teaching a course on social justice applications of engineering knowledge? When the day came for her guest lecture, the auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Students sat in aisles. Faculty members stood along the walls. The live stream reached thousands more. She stepped up to the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. young engineers who'd followed her story, public defenders who'd never imagined their backgrounds could be assets, students struggling to choose between lucrative careers and meaningful work. "I want to talk to you about invisible expertise," she began, "about the assumptions people make when they see a black woman in a public defender's office, or a janitor in a corporate boardroom, or anyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of what expertise looks like." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. 3 construction workers died because wealthy lawyers assumed a public defender couldn't understand engineering. But here's what I learned. Your expertise isn't diminished by choosing service over salary. Your knowledge isn't worth less because you use it to help people instead of corporations. She gestured to her USC engineering diploma, now hanging beside her law degree in her office. The most powerful people aren't always the ones with the most expensive suits or the biggest offices. Sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones nobody sees coming. Sometimes the greatest victories happen when invisible people refuse to stay invisible. The entire auditorium rose in thunderous applause that lasted 3 full minutes. Use your gifts to level playing fields, not to maintain inequality. Challenge systems that assume intelligence comes in only one package. And remember, when someone underestimates you because of what you look like or where you come from, you have a choice. You can shrink to fit their assumptions, or you can expand to shatter them. The standing ovation continued as students chanted, "Keisha! Keisha!" a name that had become synonymous with excellence, disguised as ordinariness. Keisha still rides the subway to work every morning in her simple blazers and comfortable shoes. But now the courthouse feels different. Prosecutors approach her with genuine respect. Judges listen when she speaks. Young lawyers seek her mentorship, asking how she balances technical expertise with advocacy. Every morning, she stops by the memorial wall in the courthouse lobby. Photos of Miguel Santos, David Park, and Jerome Williams, the 3 workers who died in the Riverside collapse. Their families settled for $50 million, but more importantly, their deaths exposed systemic negligence that will save countless future lives. Young public defenders from across the city seek her guidance, bringing cases that require technical expertise they don't possess. Engineering students email asking how to use their knowledge for social justice. Remember, she tells them during her monthly mentoring sessions, expertise isn't about the prestige of your job title or the size of your paycheck. It's about using your knowledge to serve justice, especially for people who can't afford justice otherwise. Her office wall now displays both degrees equally, USC Viterbi Engineering alongside Brooklyn Law, not as a reminder of the career she abandoned, but as proof that expertise comes in many forms, and the most powerful advocacy happens when different kinds of knowledge work together. The Riverside case changed more than just one legal outcome. It challenged an entire system's assumptions about who deserves to be taken seriously, who has valuable expertise, and what intellectual strength looks like. Keisha Williams proved that the most dangerous opponents aren't always the ones with the fanciest credentials or the biggest firms. Sometimes they're the quiet ones who've been underestimated so consistently that nobody notices when they're preparing to dismantle your entire argument with precision and expertise you never saw coming. Her story reminds us that brilliance doesn't always announce itself with expensive suits and Ivy League degrees. Sometimes it sits quietly in public defender offices, in community legal clinics, in places where smart people choose service over status and justice over profit. What hidden expertise are you overlooking in your own workplace? What assumptions are you making about people based on their job titles rather than their actual knowledge? The next time you're tempted to dismiss someone because they don't look like your idea of an expert, remember Keisha Williams, because sometimes the person who can solve your most complex problem is the one you never thought to ask.